Polyphony Digital is a company with a long and thick relationship with Sony, being responsible for their flagship racing series, Gran Turismo. But once upon a time, back in the days between the transition from the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2, they made something completely different. Omega Boost is a stylish 360 degrees shooter where you take control of a futuristic combat robot facing off against a rogue AI. It was released in 1999, well into the aging console's lifetime. The game begins with a silly live-action intro that does a quick rundown of the story in the most vague way possible, but it exudes all kinds of cheese, so points for that. The plot involves the mysterious Alpha Core, a super advanced AI that had been silently supporting the development of mankind from behind the scenes. While nobody knows where it came from, humanity deemed it too powerful and dangerous and tried to shut down its far-reaching network. This goes horribly wrong, and the Alpha Core declares war on mankind as revenge. As the war continues, humans find themselves outmatched by its army of robots. Humanity's last hope lies in the discovery of time travel, which scientists plan to use to destroy the rogue AI. But being the crafty bastards that it is, the Alpha Core finds out about this plan and steals the technology. With this new power, it travels back in time and injects itself into one of the vacuum tubes on the world's very first general-use computer, which is a real thing that exists, by the way. So by copying itself into the ENIAC, the Alpha Core created a time loop in which it will always be born once humanity discovers computing. So their last hope, but for real this time, lies in the Omega Boost, a giant robot capable of traveling through time. You play as its dork pilot, Lester Hemming, and your job is to shut down the Alpha Core once and for all by replacing the infected vacuum tube, effectively erasing it from existence. Or something. You have science, technology, and even time travel. Quite a lot of babble for a game entirely about blowing up space crap. Even the game doesn't give that much of a toss about it because there's barely any actual story during the game. You get a handful of very short cutscenes and the rest is in the manual. To start with, you can either play a few short tutorials or jump right into the first mission. There's 9 of them, and they're all very short and structured almost like a boss rush. You get to fight a couple of grunts for a bit, and then you get into the bosses themselves, which are the highlight of the gameplay. You're free to move around in 360 degrees through the open environments, requiring you to pay attention and react quickly as enemies could come from all directions. To guide you, there's a compass on the bottom left, as well as a lock-on function that will immediately redirect you to your target. You also get a dash move, and because moving forward is done automatically, you can also lock yourself in place to take precise shots. The Omega Boost has 3 weapons at its disposal. One is the Vulcan gun, which is a simple projectile weapon that fires bursts of bullets and requires you to hammer the button to keep firing. It does low damage and lacks range, but against certain targets it can be useful. The second, more important one is the homing laser. Point the crosshair at your enemies and as long as you have enough charges, enemies will be locked onto, and you can launch the lasers by pressing the fire button. You start with 6 charges, but as you progress, your boost level rises, and the number of charges also increases. The homing lasers deal more damage and barely require any precision, so they are the meat and potatoes of your arsenal, and in turn also of the gameplay. It's a constant rush of quickly targeting enemies, avoiding their assault, and then going back for another pass. Your last weapon is the Viper Boost. It charges as you play, and once you have enough, you can activate it to become invincible and turn into Sonic the Space Hedgehog as you smash every enemy around you or deal massive damage to bosses. Once you complete the campaign and clear certain conditions, you can replay every stage as well as some bonus missions, with the boost level of your choice. The interesting part, however, is that normally you can only reach boost level 9, but here you can unlock more levels that sort of serve as cheats, such as granting you infinite Viper boost. Let's just say that dunking on everything with it is pretty cathartic. And I want to emphasize how smooth it plays given its age and the hardware. Controlling the player character on a 3D plane was still a relatively new thing back in 1999, and without the standardized layouts we have nowadays, different developers tried different ways to make it work, with mixed results. But then comes along Omega Boost with its simple controls and a measly 30 FPS, with some of the smoothest goddamn controls I've ever seen in a mecha game. Which I'm not sure is a testament to how talented the developers are or to how clunky most other games of its kind tend to be. It's kind of hard to illustrate this unless you're playing it yourself, but yeah, it's pretty nice. It was released late in the system's lifetime, and it looks quite amazing for something running on such humble hardware. Intentional or not, the way particles are rendered give parts of the game an almost vector-like look to them, which looks really stylish combined with its primitive motion blur effect. Oh, and you can also play it in first person, which is impractical but still pretty cool. Of course, I am running the game on an emulator, and I have the rendering resolution turned way above the PS1's capabilities, and I'm using a widescreen hack. But that just makes me wish even more for a remastered version without a 30 FPS lock. Incidentally, there seems to be a bit of confusion out there because certain sites claim that parts of the game can run at 60 FPS. Well, the only part that does is Zone U1, and it's clearly unintentional since the entire game speeds up. Regardless, Polyphony Digital has always pushed Sony's hardware, and Omega Boost is no exception to being a visual spectacle, which I guess explains why it has a replay function where you can just watch yourself blow stuff up. Hell, the marketing even talks about the beauty of destruction and blowing up a bunch of space crap, so you can tell what the developers were going for here. Though that focus on spectacle might also be why you could argue that Omega Boost is a prime example of style over substance. In some ways, that's a pretty accurate description. It looks great, it plays great. It's also very basic and lacking in depth beyond spamming the homing laser. It's not that it's brain dead levels of easy or anything. After Zone 5 it gets very tough, even on medium difficulty, and because your health doesn't fully recover between missions, you can find yourself in a bit of a pickle. There's also an obvious arcade feel in its shortness and scoring system to push you to aim for better results, and if that's not enough pain for you, there's always hard mode. But at the same time, it quickly becomes obvious that just spamming the lock-on and the homing laser is the best and almost the only relevant strategy. The need to manually reorient yourself is also completely undermined by how extreme the lock-on function is. Not only does it quickly point you towards your enemies, but you also almost never get attacked by multiple enemies from multiple different angles. The types of enemies you face are divided into squads of 4 or 5 weak enemies grouped together, that die to a single homing laser, or the bosses themselves, which are almost exclusively 1 versus 1. The Vulcan gun deals very low damage and requires manual aiming, and to do that properly you need to stop, which puts you in danger. Most enemies might not be particularly hard to deal with, but they're still firing a gazillion projectiles at you. The Viper boost is powerful and useful, but it charges so slowly and runs out so quickly that it's only really useful at full charge. Especially because about 20% of the bar is immediately wasted on the startup animation. It's also a total waste against regular enemies, while against bosses it's basically free damage. Being able to move in 360 degrees is kind of redundant. It's never really used to make you cautious about where enemies are coming from or whether they are targeting you from your blind spots, since you always know where they are thanks to the compass and the lock-on, and as such the concept gets wasted. And that's the overall impression I get from the game. It's a really good concept that feels undercooked, and that it had the potential to be something more, and to be something truly special. Between the short length, the lack of regular enemies, and it being a glorified boss rush, Omega Boost almost seems like a tech demo in some respects. Or the world's most elaborate music video. Sadly, Polyphony never went back to Omega Boost or anything of the sort. That's not necessarily a bad thing, since Gran Turismo was and still is their big chungus. But imagine a sequel on the PlayStation 2 with more enemies, more weapons, more variety, more content, and a more developed plot. The backstory is really just there for the rule of cool, but it's actually pretty interesting. You have an omnipresent god figure that led mankind to prosperity on its own absolute terms, but that then turns against mankind when they realize just how dangerous the god figure has become, to the point where it made its own existence an inevitability by going back in time and injecting itself into the world's first general-purpose computer. That's just bananas. But ultimately, is it fun? Hell yeah, it is. Omega Boost is a blast for the 2 or 3 hours it takes to complete everything. While it can be described as style over substance, it's just short enough to end with a sweet bang right before the dullness starts to creep in. So perhaps more than style over substance, Omega Boost is the definition of short and sweet.